Good afternoon. My name is Jonathan Kaplan, and I would like to welcome you to the Schusterman Center for Jewish Studies, where I serve as the director of the center, as well as being a faculty member in the Department of Middle Eastern Studies. I want to, just as a way of introduction, highlight that this is not only an event of Israel studies, which Dr. Karen Grunberg will talk about in just a minute, but we are also beginning a new graduate student colloquium in Jewish studies designed to draw together faculty, graduate student affiliates of the center to present at lunch colloquiums like this throughout the academic year. So if you're interested in the future in presenting at one of these colloquiums, please let me know and we can work on scheduling that and arranging it. I'm hopeful that we'll have a couple each semester and delighted to have Atalia here as our first presenter for what sounds like an amazing talk. Two other quick announcements to draw your attention to the Schusterman Center's website. Coming up this coming week, we have Stephanie Pridgeon, who will be here next Wednesday for a lunchtime talk, Absorption Narratives, Jewishness, Blackness, and Indigeneity in the Cultural Imaginary of the Americas. And there's a link on our website for registering for that if you'd like to have lunch. And then Thursday, September 7th at 5 p.m., we're also having a welcome back reception in here at 5 p.m. We welcome everyone to that and hope you're able to make it. Thank you.
Hi everyone and welcome. Thank you for coming. I don't think that we realized, Atalia, when we scheduled this, that this was the beginning of Labor Day weekend. So I'm really glad to see so many people here at this event today. I'm Karen Grunberg. I'm director of the Center for Middle Eastern Studies, and I'm also faculty coordinator of Israel Studies at the Schusterman Center for Jewish Studies here at UT. Today's presentation is part of the Israel Studies Graduate Fellow Program. We would like to gratefully acknowledge the support of several units: the Department of Anthropology, the Department of Sociology, LGBTQ Studies, the Center, now Department of Women and Gender Studies, the Department of Germanic Studies, the Program in Comparative Literature, and the Center for Middle Eastern Studies. This diverse support is integral to the mission of Israel Studies at UT Austin, to promote scholarship on diverse perspectives and experiences of Israeli culture and society, and to foreground multivocal and heterogeneous narratives overshadowed by dominant historical and political discourses. The Graduate Fellowship in Israel Studies is critical in carrying out this mission in the context of graduate education. This competitive fellowship was created to help recruit to UT Austin excellent doctoral students working on Israel from any disciplinary perspective. It supplements funds from the Students' Home Program or Department to help support rigorous original research in Israel Studies. At the end of the fellowship period, we ask that fellows share their work in a public presentation, and that is the occasion that brings us here today. Atalia Israeli-Nevo, our Israel Studies graduate fellow for the last 2 years, is beginning her 3rd year in the doctoral program in the Department of Anthropology. She has published articles on transgender temporality and queer kinships and is the co-organizer of both the Transfeminisms Reading Group and the Posthumanism Reading Group here at UT. She's also served as assistant editor of QT Voices, the LGBTQ Studies program's online magazine. Some of you may have attended Atalia's illuminating fellow presentation at the end of her 1st year at UT. From resistance to cooptation, pinkwash, transnationalism, and queer politics in Israel-Palestine. We are delighted to have the opportunity to hear what she's been working on since then. Today's talk is entitled Queer Utopias, Israeli-German Nationalisms, and Animal Labor. Please help me welcome Atalia.
I think I have, yeah. Thank you so much, and thank you so much for the support of both the Schusterman Center and Israel Studies for the past 2 years. It has been really helpful, not to TA, during the first 2 years of courses. So I'm just gonna put a timer just to make sure that there's time for questions. But I wanted to start off and say that this title is a bit of a lie, because I'm barely going to talk about queer utopias. Hopefully I'll be able to talk much more about that after my dissertation fieldwork, in which I'm interested in exploring queer rural narratives and animal labor in Germany and Israel-Palestine. Wait. Are we here? Okay. So just a quick note about that. While the queer subject has been culturally and historically linked to the urban metropolis, recent queer geographical studies have shown that LGBTQ people throughout the global north have been moving out of the city to suburban or rural locations, forming sort of queer natural or rural utopias. These communities hold many different narratives regarding their own subjectivities and the meaning of queerness as opposed to LGBTQ people who live in cities. These aspects and narratives have only recently started to garner scholarly attention, and my dissertation project, hopefully, aims to delve into these kinds of questions among others. What kind of stories do these German and Israeli queer farmers tell about themselves and others? How do they see the agricultural environment they live in? How do they navigate within the larger farming community? How do they relate to forms of labor, inclusion and exclusion within their larger cultural and material frameworks? So in today's talk, I'm going to focus on the historical background of these communities and how they tie into questions of nationality, exclusion, and labor. Specifically, I will try to elaborate on historical national narratives of both German nationalism and Zionism, and will try to illustrate not only how they are connected to each other, but also how they are rooted in the idea and practice of animal labor. By doing so, I'm trying to situate my future ethnographic work in the geopolitical, agricultural, and animalistic, for lack of a better term, context of my interlocutors, in order to ask how these narratives play out in their lives and how can I, and hopefully we as an academic community, can seriously take into account notions of animal exploitation and labor into our analysis. So, since this is sort of historical groundwork for my future fieldwork, this paper tries to touch upon key points, but it is by no means exhaustive. Some of the historical background, for instance, of West Germany, as well as the environmental movements, both in Germany and in Israel-Palestine, are missing here, and are part of what I'm intending to explore in the upcoming year. So bear with me, even if I miss some things, because this is a work in progress. Okay. Farmers and peasants fulfilled an important role in the consolidation of German nationalism. They were early supporters of Otto von Bismarck, the national hero of German unification in the 1870s. German peasantry was nationally informed by two contemporary cultural ideas within German nationalism, namely the idea of Lebensraum, or living space in English, and the idea of physical fitness, masculinity, and the natural state of the body. Lebensraum, or as I said, living space, became later associated with the Nazi conquest of Europe and parts of North Africa during the Second World War. But it was an idea that preceded National Socialism. It was developed by geographer and naturalist Friedrich Ratzel, who is the first of many bearded men that we'll see in this presentation, he defined Lebensraum as, and I quote, the geographical surface area required to support a living species as its current population size and mode of existence. Taking cue from Darwinian evolutionary ideas, there were two evolutionary survival elements of Lebensraum. The first was migration, the movement of a species into a new space, and colonization, the effective exploration and occupation of that space. The second element was dependence on the working of the land. Now, Ratzel didn't necessarily mean the occupation of other human groups by a specific group of humans. Rather, he meant that humans as a species should have enough space to work the land in order to survive. And the solution for him was agriculture. And while he didn't specifically speak of animal husbandry, both the work on meat, dairy, and poultry, as well as the use of animals for crop agriculture, is within the basis of this idea. For Ratzel, a return to nature, quote unquote, was essential for the construction of modern German nationalism. Aaron David Gordon, a Russian Zionist labor thinker and naturalist, had a similar notion. In his seminal work, Ha'adam ve'ateva, Man and Nature, Gordon argues that in order for the Jewish man to construct a nation, he must first realign himself with nature. And Gordon saw this as a sort of rebirth, and I quote my own lacking translation from Hebrew. You would look into the eyes of nature and you would see in it your own image. and you would know that you have returned to yourself, that by ignoring nature, you have ignored yourself, end quote. Gordon's narrative of nature echoes the historian William Cronin's theory of the allure of wilderness, where he argues that the wild and nature are closely associated with secular transcendence, authenticity, and dreams of expansion and occupation. Gordon's ideology connects between the national man and nature, and while it envisions a harmony with the natural world, we'll soon see how this vision inspired human-made transformation of nature and its animal inhabitants. Now, the second ideology that German farming was based in was an older one that originates in the invention of gymnastics, bodywork, and the modern German or European or colonial masculinity. We're talking about now about another Friedrich, an earlier one, Friedrich Ludwig Jahn, who was a German educator and nationalist who advocated for a nationalism based in the creative force of the German folk or people. Jahn, who is considered to be the founder of modern gymnastics, saw the work of the human body as essential to the project of nation building. The training and practice of the German man, the cultivation of his muscles, speed and accuracy, are what the German people needed to construct a spiritual bond between the German individual body and the German nation. European Zionists took cue of the burgeoning notion of fitness, masculinity, power, and nationalism. It fitted their wish to offer a different kind of narrative to the Jewish man. Mirroring anti-Semitic cultural notions of the diasporic Jewish man as an effeminate and unfit learned student, early Zionists aimed to create a quote-unquote new Jewish man, a Yehudi Chadash, who will be able to protect himself and his community, who will be fit to conquer and rule, and will be able to shed his former diasporic skin. Max Nordau, yes, a lot of those. Max Nordau, the Hungarian-Austrian co-founder, along with Theodor Herzl, of the World Zionist Organization, coined this idea under the term of muscular Judaism. In Hebrew it's Yahadut HaShririm, but it's originally in German, Muskeljudentum. And I quote from his article that's called Muscular Judaism. Sitting in our ghetto prison for thousands of years, we had to lose our physical fitness, abandoning training and practice. Now that we are missing it, we must work hard in order to regain this quality. Indeed, the Jewish man falls in height compared to others around him. This phenomenon is highlighted in those countries filled mostly with German or Slavs, and he later contrasted that actually in other places in the world that doesn't happen. So we see here not only a yearning for a different kind of muscular body, but a not so covert eugenic thinking that yearns for a European body, and specifically German or Slavic, for the Jews to occupy and manifest. Livestock farming allowed for an ideal cultural institution, both for German nationalists and their contemporary, mostly German-speaking Zionists, to achieve this kind of nature-based, bodily labor-based, and masculine national idea. Up until World War I, farming boosted across Germany. Livestock farming, and specifically cattle and sheep farming, became the ideal not only in Germany itself, but also in the German colonies in Africa at the turn of the century. The vision of an animal farming colony took hold especially in German Southwest Africa, a colony that was located in what is today Namibia. While the indigenous African Herero and Nama communities did have cattle herds, German colonists and geographers sought to import new breeds of cows as well as sheep to the inner arid desert area of the colony. This required access to water, not only for the German colonists and their family, but also for the livestock itself that required a lot of water to sustain the farm and to be sustained. Large-scale infrastructure projects were issued that included damming of rivers and boring for water. This not only changed the lay of the land, but also the unique ecosystems in the area, transforming the landscape and herding the various animal species around. German naturalists, geographers, and politicians in the colony praised the German pioneers who worked hard in this impossible landscape, creating a German haven amidst the treacherous African climate. The narrative was, to quote environmental historian Martin Kalb, the German farmers in the colony, with, and I quote, their strong cultural background and steady character, could withstand foreign natures, climates, and people, end quote. At the same time, German colonists had to depend on the local indigenous communities' resources and labor. For instance, German farmers stole hundreds of cows from local herds. In addition, not only did most of the farm work was done by African laborers, they also constructed the very foundation of dams and water drilling. As one German contemporary noted, and I quote, "Even the construction of infrastructure that comes first in the development of the country is only possible based on the labor of the natives," end quote. The notion of a colonial paradise that was single-handedly built by German farmer pioneers persisted even after the First World War, and was also part of the cultural zeitgeist that masked the genocide of the Nama and the Herero by the Germans, which constituted the first genocide in the 20th century. The use of livestock for colonial purposes echoes in the important work of historian John Ryan Fisher, who argues that the introduction of cattle in the American West and the Pacific formed an important colonial agent in both California and Hawaii, disrupting existing indigenous farming communities and ecologies. Fisher and others illustrate how animals almost always play an important part in colonial histories and post-colonial presence. Farming was also essential to Zionist ideology, bringing together labor and the colonization of the land. The Zionist colonization of Palestine in the early 1910s, where young, many times socialist Zionists migrated from Eastern Europe, marked that shift. Gordon, who I mentioned earlier, the guy who liked nature, was called by them the founder of the religion of labor, Dat HaAvoda. He served as their spiritual and ideological mentor. As opposed to previous Zionists who have already settled in the first Jewish colonies in Palestine, these young people viewed labor as a way of reclaiming and occupying the land. While the older Zionist settlers hired cheap Palestinian laborers to work their crops, these new Zionist socialists were aiming, in their own ideological words, to occupy the labor, or in Hebrew it's called kibush avoda. They insisted to be hired instead of the indigenous Palestinian population in order for them to get a chance to train and practice in the work of the land. When the older settlers preferred to keep on hiring Palestinian laborers who demanded less money for their work, the Zionist socialists got to a settlement with the Yishuv, the Zionist administration in Palestine. They would work collectively on lands owned by the administration and later by the Israeli state, cultivate them through crop and animal agriculture, and live off of it, selling the surplus for the sake of the community. These were the first kibbutzim, socialist Zionist settlements based on collective shared labor and property. As opposed to previous Zionist settlers, these first kibbutzniks' motto was Avoda Ivrit, or Hebrew labor, emphasizing the important role of labor done solely by Jewish Zionists for Jewish Zionists. Their labor was an agricultural fulfillment of Max Nordau's virile vision of the muscular Jew. This, as well as their colonization of the land, directly contradicted their socialist values, preventing work and confiscating land from the indigenous Palestinian communities. This logic would later extend to Mizrahi Jews who migrated later to Palestine and the State of Israel in its early days from Arab and Muslim countries. But the logic of Hebrew labor and an unequal division of labor extended also to the non-human world. Part of the Zionist agricultural effort was the development of a mixed farm, in Hebrew Meshek Me'orav, a farm economy that is based both in crops and in animal agriculture, but which prioritized mostly dairy and poultry products. These ideas were developed by German Zionist agronomists and economists who migrated to Palestine, usually after they studied agriculture in Germany. One of these economists, Arthur Rupin, studied at Humboldt University in Berlin and became a prominent figure in the Zionist Yishuv, leading one of its most important institutions, the Palestine Office of the Zionist Executive. Rupin insisted on the importance of the mixed farm. According to him, while the Arab falach, or peasant or farmer, raises a small number of farm animals and bases his labor and income on crops such as olives and wheat, the Zionist farmer should shift his focus to dairy and actively engage in crossbreeding different breeds of cattle that would produce efficiently dozen more liters of milk. Rupin was also an avid supporter of eugenics, although his seminal work on the topic, Darwinism and Social Sciences, was never translated from its original German. He was fascinated and closely followed farm animals crossbreeding, and specifically cows. At one point, he noted that the best crossbreeding would be between Lebanese, German, and Dutch cows. These Zionist efforts were also geared toward eliminating unwanted, unproductive, quote-unquote, domestic animal species. The most known example in Palestine is that of the black goat, who used to graze wild areas in the land and was sometimes herded by Palestinian herders. Zionist experts viewed the black goat as a pest that ruins the environment, preferring a foreign European breed of goats the white so-called house goat. As environmental ethnographer Iris Braverman articulates, and I quote, "The black goat, who used to symbolize the diasporic Jew, as reflected in Marc Chagall's paintings, for example, has come to represent for the early Israeli state the rebellious Arab farmer, the falach, a scapegoat for everything that has gone awry with nature in this region." End quote. This actually culminated in the first environmental legislation of the State of Israel in 1950, the Plant Protection Act, commonly referred to as the Black Goat Act, which set restrictions on goat numbers and herding range and forbade the animals' entry into forested areas or nature reserves. Back in Germany, and 20 years earlier, farmers suffered many setbacks during the turbulent years of the Weimar Republic. However, they came to the fold of German national ideology with the rise of National Socialism in the 1930s. The famous Nazi slogan, Blut und Boden, blood and soil, brings together the nation's racial body with settlement and expansion. Reclaiming Ratzel's Lebensraum, living space, Nazi ideologues claimed that the German folk, or people, need space to expand for it to fulfill the ideal form of life, which is rural farming. For the Third Reich's Minister of Food and Agriculture, Richard Walter Dare, who wrote in 1928 the book Peasantry as Life Source of the Nordic Race, Nordic and Aryan farmers were superior to Eastern European ones due to their access to both superior land and superior animal breeds. In his later book, A New Nobility Based on Blood and Soil, he proposed a systematic eugenic program of selective breeding of both humans and animals. For Nazi ideologues and bureaucrats like Dare, German farming would eliminate the need to rely on foreign material and food imports. Thus, state efforts were made to cultivate farming technologies as well as extensive animal breeding experimental programs. One of these programs was concerned with breeding the perfect pig. Nazi scientists and agricultural experts sought to create a pig that is, quote-unquote, rooted in the soil, or bodenständig in German, a term that originates in the philosophy of philosopher Martin Heidegger. Those pigs not only had to be excessively fattened in order to secure meat for the nation, they were fed solely German fodder as opposed to other pig breeds who would eat fodder imported from the United States or Argentina. Ideally, rooted in the soil pigs would inhabit the new farmlands in the expanding Nazi living space. Other breeds of pigs should be eliminated, for they did not comply with the new standard of Nazi ecology. As STS historian Tiago Saraiva puts it, and I quote, "Only fat, bodenständig pigs were fascist pigs, and they were the only ones that deserved to be part of the new fascist collective," end quote. Pigs continued to be a national obsession after the end of the Second World War, this time under the state socialism of the German Democratic Republic, or the GDR, the Eastern German state founded after the division of Germany to two Germanys at the end of the war. While the state forced farmers to collectivize, state efforts were also carried out to crossbreed an efficient pig breed that would not only provide meat for the nation, but would also allow the state to import pork. And indeed, GDR experts managed to breed American, Yugoslavian, and German pigs into several productive pig hybrids. In the State of Israel, pigs never became part of the national consensus because eating pork is not kosher, and thus it is still to this day contested within Zionist meat-eating circles. On the other hand, cows became the national treasures, fulfilling the early Zionist scientists' vision of a blooming dairy industry. Cows became closely associated with agricultural towns such as the Moshavim, which were semi-communal agricultural small worker towns, and of course the kibbutzim. Working in the cowshed was an integral part of communal life, and every kibbutz, up until those were privatized during the 1990s, every kibbutz member, up until those were privatized during the 1990s, had to work there at some point. One example of the material and symbolic meanings associated with cows, nationalism, and Zionist socialism is that of stavit, Hebrew for autumnal, a cow who became famous in the kibbutz of Kfar Giladi. In 1950, Stavit was crowned as the champion of champions in a national ceremony with 1,500 people from neighboring kibbutzim and from abroad, coming to honor her. Having produced more milk than any cow on record, she was globally, she was cherished by the kibbutz movement. Postcards were distributed with her picture, her portrait was published in national newspaper, and when she died, several obituaries were dedicated to her. Stavit was a multi-layered symbol of Zionism. She was a productive laborer, both in her milk production and in her production of calves and cows. In that sense, she also represented productive motherhood that contributed offspring for the good of the nation. As animal historian Tamar Novik puts it, Stavit was an example of an individual animal who represented multiple important roles in the Zionist settler project: productivity, fertility, a living body that is also a machine that can encapsulate and manifest a vision of plenty. In 1953, Stavit died. Here is an obituary published in the National Davar newspaper, which reads in Hebrew, "Stavit has died. Stavit, the queen of cows, who held a world record in milk production, has passed away in the Kfar Giladi farm. Stavit became seriously ill in her liver and legs, and since she couldn't be cured, the doctors decided to free her from her agony by slaughtering her. Stavit was 19 years old, and during her lifespan she produced, I try to translate it to pounds, but I'll stay with the kilos. But so she produced 107.971 kilograms of milk. She calved 15 times. End of the obituary. While Stavit was, according to every national expert and admirer, a productive worker, it didn't save her from being slaughtered, and her meat was used for consumption. This is an important point in these socialist stories, whether it's in the socialist Zionist kibbutz movement or in the state socialism of the GDR. In both cases, animals were not only used as products or materials, they were also de facto laborers or forced laborers, and should be considered part of this labor history as well. Eventually, for different reasons, these socialist productive animal dreams failed. Animal historian Thomas Fleischmann illustrates how the GDR's industrial pig eventually posed more problems than solutions. The state couldn't produce enough grain to feed the overpopulating pigs. Crops were over-fertilized and pigs were poisoned in the process. The farmers, who couldn't manage the unprecedented quantities of urine and feces, stockpiled mountains of waste that in turn contaminated drinking water. This in turn gave rise to the garden pig that people started raising in their own yards, and descendants of those pigs can still be found in small-scale farms in rural Germany today. And as for the kibbutzim, most all of them were privatized at the end of the 1980s and during the 90s. While their socialist dream failed, they still hold symbolic power within Zionist narratives and sit on fertile land that holds not only symbolic meaning but also material wealth. And while cows, sheep, and chickens are not anymore part of a Zionist socialist ideal, they are still being labored there and are part of the landscape into which the queers I originally talked about, who leave the city, move into. What is then the future of animal labor, and how does it connect to ideas of queerness and utopia? As I promised at the beginning of the talk, I'm not going to answer that question, at least not at this point of my research. But hopefully, I was able to illustrate and show how throughout both German nationalisms, in their various circulations and adaptations, and in Zionism, animals and animal labor play a major role in the colonial, sexual, and ideological narratives and production of these two national movements. It is important to remember and note, as I highlighted earlier, that these animals were not only tools of exclusion and exploitation, but were and are in and of themselves exploited beings that further research needs to be addressing. Recent queer studies in the past decade or so have sought to problematize white queer identities and show how queer politics in the global north is often co-opted to state violence, neocolonialism, the war on terror, far-right politics, and anti-migration rhetoric and legislation. So I think it's time to rethink those relations also vis-a-vis animal rights and labor, and take animals into account in questions of queer environmental utopias. Because as anthropologist Kasia Paprocki puts it, one person's utopia may very well be another person's dystopia. Thank you.
So are there questions people would like to offer? Yeah. Yes, Sophia.
First question already?
Yeah, hello. I mean, I shouldn't be asking a question, but I'm obviously very intrigued, especially since this is also material that I was not aware of, that you were interested in it. So just a couple of comments. And first of all, I'm very much fascinated, never mind the queer aspect, but the symbolism of particular animals. I mean, this is something that you are really highlighting here, which I find very intriguing. And then it's not only the animal itself, it's the way in which the animal is being raised also, you know, and the way you contextualize that by giving this GDR example is quite fascinating. I was just thinking in terms of, I mean, the focus here is on rural Berlin on the one hand and Israel-Palestine on the other, but I mean, the little bits and pieces I know about the relatively new, let's call it Jewish conquest of the land, there are very interesting parallels in this country, for instance. I mean, thinking about urban Orthodox populations from New York City moving out into upstate New York. And so it's very interesting what is being produced and reproduced there, I mean, in terms of models. And then I was also thinking about, well, we don't know each other personally, but I'm thinking about Argentina and also the, I mean, something equivalent that has been going on there, where for a very long time, and if I'm not mistaken, even preceding the establishment of the State of Israel, you did have formerly urban Jewish populations, and then again, I mean, in that particular case, it is not only you know, Orthodox, which obviously historically would be a relatively new phenomenon in terms of that quote-unquote return to the land. And my final point, and these are not even questions, but just associations that I'm having listening to you, is the symbolism, again, going back to that trope of the animal. And so I'm thinking of that partly documentary, partly animated movie by, I forgot his first name, but Palestinian movie maker Shmali, The Missing 18. And it's about cows in Beit Sahur, outside of Bethlehem, who essentially go, quote unquote, missing. And the hide, and obviously it's all, I mean, it's a commentary on the Israeli military occupation. It's done in a very, very subtle, very interesting, and also very humoristic way. And then what is really interesting, and this is something that you haven't mentioned here, again, and I'll finish on that note, I mean, about symbolism, is naming. You know, the naming, especially once that relationship becomes personal. And all of these cows in that movie, did you watch it? Do have Jewish Ashkenazi female first names. So I'll leave it at that. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Sophia. These are very important points, and I think the symbolism extends much further than what I've mentioned. Yes, so also I'll stand. At least from what I know, yes, also in kibbutzim and in other farms in Israel, yes, these would be the names that usually cows are given. Also stavit, for those of you who know Hebrew, these days it's a weird name. It's very old. I'm not even sure I know anyone who has that name. But it's also interesting what you were saying about how animals are being raised, because I think that, for instance, part of what's happening in the area of the Mount Hebron in the West Bank today is that there are ongoing clashes between settlers, between Jewish settlers there, and the Palestinian community there, which is mostly a herder community. And what usually happens as settlers expand, they actually also change the way the animals that a lot of the times they steal are raised. So it becomes from a herding economy into a farm economy. So that's also part of what's still ongoing today, both in Israel per se and also in the occupied territories. Yeah. These are first thoughts on your comments. Yeah.
Other questions?
First of all, thank you. A very interesting presentation. I'm curious to hear you talk a little bit more about animal labor, not just labor on animals, or labor with animals, or the labor of animals symbolically, but actual animal labor itself. I'm curious where you're going with that, if you're pursuing that at all, in terms of animal agencies.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's all.
Yeah, I am for sure pursuing that. I think it's a subject I'm still contemplating on, but I think that, ethnographers I'm inspired by that talk about animal labor, and it's a lot of the times you can't really totally disconnect animal labor and the labor of the humans that are laboring them and that are laboring next to them. But I actually think that one way to think about it is think more and more in Marxist terms. So, for instance, how Marx thinks of enclosures and how it was the basis of capitalist economy. So part of the idea of enclosures is also part of the idea of the farm, and then thinking through it not only on workers and human laborers, but also the work of animals themselves is a way of thinking about it. How to write about it ethnographically, that's a question I'm still contemplating, and how to even observe that ethnographically and think through, when I'm seeing an animal and how she or he works or labors, and how to write about it after that. That's still something I'm thinking about. Yeah. I'll move this.
Thanks, Jonathan. Thank you, Talia. This was so informative. Thanks a lot, and we look forward to your work. My question is, you draw a very interesting parallel between German nationalism and, for lack of a better term, Zionist socialism, and the kind of intellectual currents that are overlapping and maybe influenced. And a lot of them are German trained from the academy, so there's sort of a synergy there. But in early 20th century, there's also another socialist Jewish current in Europe, the Bund, right? And which is very important. And of course, there's a whole debate with the Bolsheviks and the Bund about, and Rosa Luxemburg comes in as well, and things like that about whether Jews are a nation or not, right? And sort of the way Stalin and Lenin sort of deal with it, and and Rosa and Luxemburg's critique. But Bund are very important, especially in Central Europe, and they may have a different kind of vision, which sort of may complicate. Of course, history is written in the perspective of what sort of quote unquote partially becomes successful. But I think that tradition needs to be also excavated if you are going to talk, not you, if I or anyone else, because I think slowly and gradually that sort of slips out of history. And the sort of very strong socialist Jewish tradition, which sort of creates a very different kind of vision of the future. And specifically, and of course, the queer utopia stuff, of course, you will work on, but specifically in terms of relationship with land, relationship with territory, relationship with social organization, and with others, right? And so sorry, I just thought of...
No, that's a really important point, and I think the Bund history usually, gets sidelined, and I think it's a really important point. I'm not at all I'm not at all an expert, or not. I barely know anything in that regard, but I think it's a really important point. Thank you. Yeah.
Just as we're thinking about that, I want to add a kind of additional group, and which is really like a lot of the quotes sort of were written from a very urban Jewish perspective in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but there were tremendous small communities of Jews scattered throughout that area, both in the Pale of Settlement in Ukraine and other places, where the basic life of the Jewish community was agriculturally oriented, but not in the same way that you have this sort of communal technocratic farming that you have in the kibbutz movement. So to some degree, the characterization of the early Zionists of urban Jewish life is a bit of a misnomer of what's actually happening in Europe.
And just to talk about utopia, one cannot sort of disregard Bloch's work, especially post-World War, right? And Benjamin, and also the Messianic Judaism, right? I think there is that something, and the whole issue of utopia, I think one has to think about Bloch in some ways.
Let me just because I have the mic and then I'll pass it around to other folks, just because I'm thinking about utopia as well. The whole notion of an agricultural utopia is spreading much earlier. So like the earliest utopian constructions, I think of Plato, like there's a strong emphasis on the gymnasium in Book 4 of the Republic, which I think fits in with your narrative. But if you look back to earlier utopian constructions, what's interesting about what you're doing with animal studies and bringing that into the conversation is you're highlighting the absence of animals for most of these utopian realities. Whether it's, I mean, the Garden of Eden is its own kind of space because that's generally regarded as a utopian text. But Arcadia, for instance, lacks kind of animals in the bucolics. It's very much about the pastoralism of the space rather than the presence of animals. And then I think even other ancient utopias, like in the Bible, the sort of construction of the ideal space of Israel when the Israelites first settle the land and conquer from the Canaanites, it really has very little to do with animals. It's about space and ownership and dominion, but not in this heavily technocratic, centrally organized way. It's much more diffuse.
Yeah.
So that might be that. I'm thinking about the interventions that your work can really make in utopian studies as a field, which I think might really help expand the vocabulary by bringing the animal studies approach. So, yeah, I think we had Safi, and then we'll go back around this way.
I'm glad Jonathan broke the ice on talking about biblical stuff. So obviously the movements that you're talking about, early Zionism especially, is very secular. But have you thought at all about or seen any patterns between kind of the elevation in some of the biblical texts, like of animal farming over like crop farming? I think it seems like there might be a very there is this very old tradition in like Jewish texts of being a pastoral people over, like having farms, crops and stuff. I wonder if you've thought about that at all.
I didn't. No, but it's a good way to think about that, and also, as you said, yes, this movement is very secular, but also it constantly has its own tensions with how to deal with the biblical text. The way I see it, at least, is that the biblical text is one of the main things that give hold to the Zionist claim to Palestine. So and I think it's not surprising that Gordon, for instance, was called this kind of a secular priest. This idea that they were constantly looking for something that can sort of replace this thing, but we're also constantly base themselves sort of in some ways on biblical ideas or biblical texts or biblical traditions. But thank you.
Thank you. When I saw the queer utopia section, like title, that beginning, automatically I think about Jose Esteban Munoz, his conceptualization of like queerness in that sense, but which also contains Bloch's work, obviously. But I'm specifically curious about like how you conceptualize queerness. What does queerness mean in that sense, in this particular context? And also utopia, like you don't have to answer that, but I'm just asking if you ever thought about that, and maybe if you can say some like some things about like what kinds of queer theory you use, like if you're using that for your methodology, or like what is the queer side of things.
Yeah. We just talked about it in our meeting. How do I how do I think about queerness in my research? And I think, for instance, people I met in the summer during my preliminary fieldwork in Germany were mostly gays and lesbians, small-scale farmers. So it's not as much as thinking about queerness as a radical politics as it is about, I don't want to say identitarian terms, but sort of trying to see how they see their own lives, or lives as people who don't lead straight lives, for a lack of better words. For the question of what kind of queer theory I'm thinking about, I don't know yet. But Munoz is for sure in my mind when I think about utopias, and utopias is for sure something I'm bringing to the table. And it's a way I, for now at least, project my own thoughts about these kinds of communities, because as I said at the beginning of the talk, there's this idea of the urban queer, or the urban gay person, and then there's this idea of going back to the land or going outside of the city, and different kinds of narratives happen in that space, even if they are a bit more complicated than, we completely left the city, because usually it's, or I don't know if usually, but a lot of times it's not really the case. It's not that it's a complete, putting the city behind and being in a new space, but there are complicated relations with the city. But also I think that it connects to this idea of what kind of community they're trying to build. And this community, because it's outside of the city, because it's in farming areas, because it's in small rural spaces, usually connects also to the work of the land and to some kind of connection or some kind of relations with animals. And then it'll be interesting to see what kind of communities are actually happening there, and how do these people think about their own communities in that sense. I hope it sort of answered. I think I hijacked your question sort of, but yeah.
My question only reveals my own ignorance, but why did so many kibbutzim go private in the late 80s and early 90s? That certainly looks like the eclipse of utopianism, no?
Labor lost.
Sorry, what did Kamran say?
Labor lost.
Yeah, labor lost, and they went into debt. A lot of them had to be bought. A lot of them went into debt. The model that sort of worked in the 50s, in the 60s, and in the 70s, and it worked partly because they were a small percent of the Israeli population, but they actually got a lot of backing from the state. And as the government, as state structure changed, the willingness to extend this hand to this movement, that was less and less popular. And eventually, most of the kibbutzim decided to privatize because they couldn't maintain themselves. That was. There were two crises. One at the end of the 80s, and one, or actually there was an ongoing crisis, but two settlements that they got with the state. One at the end of the 80s and one mid 90s. There are a few kibbutzim that are still not privatized, but they're very few.
So the romance of the ideology was gone. Is that part of it?
Yeah, but I think that this I try to also speak of it a little bit in the paper, but because this was a very small percent of the population, the extent that this utopic vision extended itself was small. It extended itself only to very few members of, for lack of a better term, the inhabitants of Israel-Palestine. So we're talking about, mostly Ashkenazi communities that live there, that sitting on lands that were formerly, of course, Palestinian, but also most of those kibbutzim didn't allow for Mizrahi Jews, Jews from Arab and Muslim countries, to join them. So it was always about, and well, this goes, I guess, back to utopian theories in general, but it was also always about inclusion and exclusion. It was always, the people who actually held that dream were actually very few. Yeah.
Sorry, I'll be quick. First of all, just really cool talk. I never thought about a lot of these relationships before, so it was really cool to learn about.
Thanks.
What you said about, you mentioned Cronin, and it just got me thinking about how he said that white settlers, like Anglos in America, kind of seized indigenous land under the rationale that they were like misusing it almost with indigenous farming practices, and that just kind of reminded me of that and made me think about the like Israeli narrative of like I think they say making the desert bloom. And kind of I was just kind of wondering your thoughts on like how Israeli like farming and irrigation almost like influences this kind of like I guess ideology there.
Yeah. So so you're totally right, and I think the black goat, for instance, is one example. What didn't get into the talk is that actually these days, a lot of animal experts say that the black goat actually doesn't hurt the environment at all. It's actually quite crucial to keep the environment. But in the 1950s, there was this Black Goat Act. So the same happens with, so yeah, this narrative went both to the indigenous Palestinian community and also to animals or to ecosystems that have been around Palestine. And we see that with the drying of the swamps, and we see that with basically Zionists didn't really like raise olive trees, although for centuries this was one of the main crops that was raised. I don't know if we say raised about crops, but whatever. That was grown in Palestine. So there are various and I don't know if exactly they have an ecological narrative around it, but even the example I gave earlier in the questions about settlers moving from herder economy to farming economy, that's also part of it. So yes, like Ronan, it's always really connected to also ideas of misusing the land and how to. With Zionism, it wasn't really about sort of keeping the land as it is, but they did have this idea of, but there are. We should go back to how things were, speaking of Bible, during the Bible. So we actually see that also with animals, with, now I forget the name of the animal in English, but Ye'elim, gazelles actually. So actually there were Zionist experts that during the 50s and the 60s tried to bring the biblical mythological gazelle back to Israel from Europe, which bringing back a species to where it hasn't been for hundreds and many times thousands of years is actually a lot of the times also harmful for the species itself. It not only hurts the ecosystem, the existing ecosystem, but a lot of the times what happens is that a lot of animals of that species actually die in the process because there's a transition period. So that's also an example. So we see these examples in many Zionist projects in the area, but yes, it goes back to this basically this colonial idea of going into the land and using it right and eliminate the people, both human and non-human, or remove the people, human and non-human, that misuse it or hurt it. Yeah.
Well, on that happy utopian note, thank you, Atalia, for a wonderful talk.
Thank you.